Hello, I'm Sarah Coates and you're watching i24 News. British MPs are voting again on whether they want Britain to leave the European Union without a deal. Now, last night MPs rejected Theresa May's draft deal with the EU for a second time by a massive margin of 149, only 2 weeks before Britain is set to leave the EU. Now, if MPs vote against leaving on March 29 without a deal, then they'll vote on Thursday whether to ask the EU for an extension. The opposition Labor Party is calling for a general election, while Theresa May says she profoundly regrets the vote.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker, I profoundly regret the decision that this House has taken tonight. I continue to believe that by far the best outcome is that the United Kingdom leaves the European Union in an orderly fashion with a deal. And that the deal we've negotiated is the best and indeed the only deal available. But, Mr. Speaker, I would like to set out briefly how the government means to proceed. 2 weeks ago, I made a series of commitments from this dispatch box regarding the steps we would take in the event that this House rejected the deal on offer. I stand by those commitments in full.
Government has been defeated again by an enormous majority, and they must now accept their deal, their proposal, the one the Prime Minister has put, is clearly dead and does not have the support of this House. And quite clearly, no deal must be taken off the table. We've said that before and we'll say that again. But it does mean the House has got to come together with a proposal that could be negotiated. The Labour Party has put that proposal, and we will put that proposal again.
And for more on this developing story, let's now go to London to our UK correspondent, Jonathan Sashadotti, who is standing by. Jonathan, thank you. Firstly, tell us what exactly is happening right now there.
Well, right now, just a bit of parliamentary drama going on. One of the 2 amendments that was to be put to vote before Theresa May's own motion that was tabled regarding taking a no-deal Brexit off the table has now been withdrawn by the person, Caroline Spelman, the MP who had proposed it in the first place. It's a bit of discussion whether or not that would mean that it should be voted on or not, because it was already, as the Speaker said, in the ownership of the House. They are now voting over it, despite the fact that she wanted to remove it from the table. So what this really means is that during the next 15 minutes, the members of Parliament are now filing out of the House of Commons. They'll be counted in either of the 2 lobbies they go to, the yeses or nos, and then in about 15 minutes, there'll be a result on that vote. There'll be 2 of those amendments like that, and then after about 45 minutes, there'll be the result of the vote on the main motion itself, Theresa May's, either amended or not amended, regarding whether or not Britain should leave the EU in a no-deal situation, should there be no deal agreed on.
OK, and Jonathan, tell us, what are the main areas of dispute here?
Well, the issue is really over whether or not Britain should leave the European Union without a deal in place, because Theresa May has spent 2 years negotiating with the European Union according to the process that was laid in place by the triggering of Article 50. That gave a 2-year time limit to those negotiations. And she's brought back to the UK the deal that she's agreed with the European Union for the divorce of Britain from the EU. But she's failed to get that through Parliament twice in so-called meaningful votes, the last of which was yesterday. That means there is no agreed deal. She's not been able to come up with a deal that satisfied Parliament, which means that according to the default position in British law, Britain will be coming out of the EU at the end of this month without any deal in place. So that's really why they're voting tonight, to see if that can be taken away from the realms of possibility, because that is something that almost all MPs seem to be very much against. But of course, it will just put her in the difficult position of needing to come up with a deal that they can agree on, and there seems to be something of a loop in that. So there remains this stalemate. And
Jonathan, Thursday's vote, of course, is to decide whether the UK wants to ask for more time before leaving the EU. So tell us what's likely to happen here, and how likely is it that the EU will agree to this?
Well, the expectation is that tonight the House of Commons will vote to remove no deal from the table, which then weakens Britain's negotiating position, because the threat of no deal is one that sounds hollow in Brussels. And that then tomorrow, in that vote over whether or not there should be an extension to the time limit for coming out of the EU, well, the expectation is that members of Parliament will vote to extend that deadline so that they can continue trying to find an orderly exit for Britain, for the United Kingdom, from the EU. But that is something that the 27 other member states of the EU have to agree to. And there have been voices from Brussels and Strasbourg over the last few days saying that they're not going to agree to that necessarily or automatically unless there's some indication that Britain's going to change its method of negotiation and change its positions drastically so that it's possible that they could come up with another deal. They don't see any point in dragging this on for days, weeks or months longer if the same stalemate is going to exist.
OK, Jonathan Sacerdoti there, thank you for bringing us your wonderful knowledge on this topic. And for more, let's now go to our international affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman, who joins me here in the studio. Owen, I think a lot of people find this topic quite boring, quite complex. So tell us, why does it matter?
This can be a really, really hard orange to peel, Sarah. This is a hard topic for people outside Britain to understand. I'll try to break it down for you and for our viewers. By the way, I just got here from Jerusalem at an event at the Israeli parliament. Who knew that the Israeli parliament would be a symbol of order and good government compared to what we're seeing in London right now? But Brexit is interesting because it brings together 4 different kinds of dramas. One is the drama over identity. What is the identity of Britain? Is it a European country? Is it an independent country that has an empire as it's had in the past? What is the country's identity? What is its orientation? In a lot of ways, Sarah, that was what was behind the referendum 3 years ago itself on Brexit and whether Britain should be connected to Europe. That's number one. Number two, the division over class and education, and even in this case, generation. That's a familiar divide. Americans are familiar with it from the election of Donald Trump, the division between working class and middle and upper class, between those with a college education and those without. Again, the Brexit divide really cut across that divide. Those with less education, and in Britain's case, less income, tended to vote to leave the EU, and those with higher levels of education tended to vote to remain. Also a huge generational divide in Britain, younger voters voting overwhelmingly to remain, and older voters voting overwhelmingly to leave. So you have this generational divide too. That's number two. Number 3 and number 4, these are dramas that actually have nothing to do with Brexit, but play into this. And number 3 is the divides between national regions, between England on the one hand and Scotland on the other, and between Northern Ireland on one hand and other parts of the United Kingdom. Again, Scotland, as you know, Sarah, voted on a referendum of whether to become independent. That referendum went down, but there is still 45% of the population there that wants Scotland to be an independent country. And the Scots wanted to stay in the European Union. So when the Scottish National Party is watching this debate, they're saying, well, if Britain is leaving the European Union, especially leaving now or in a few months' time without a deal, that just strengthens the argument for why Scotland should be independent. So when those members of Parliament are voting on these motions, they don't necessarily have Brexit in mind. They have their own agenda in mind, and that's even more true in the case of Northern Ireland, which could be very affected by a Brexit. And in fact, the whole dispute between Britain and the European Union is about Northern Ireland, its political status, and the border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, again against the backdrop of a long-time sectarian conflict there that's been on the wane over the past 20 years, but that threatens to pop up again because of the changes over Brexit. And the Northern Irish politicians have their own agenda in mind, in their case, about being connected to the rest of the UK and not necessarily Brexit. And number 4, the personal drama. Players like Boris Johnson, players like Jeremy Corbyn, they don't necessarily, I think, have Brexit in mind. They have their own political futures in mind, and that's why we heard Jeremy Corbyn calling for a general election. Again, and on top of this, you have processes and procedures that are often very, very convoluted and complex on both sides of the channel. Put it together, you have a huge mess, and Britain's system of 2-party adversarial government and a parliament with very strict procedures just aren't equipped to deal with all of these divisions, leading to the kind of paralysis we've seen over the past years.
OK, there's certainly a lot happening and a lot at play there. Owen Alterman, thank you for breaking that down, and we will come back to you a little later on in the bulletin. But we are taking a short break. When we come back, the Israeli Defence Forces has revealed what it calls a new Hezbollah terror network in the Syrian Golan Heights. We'll tell you just how serious of a threat this poses to Israel right after the break. Stay with us.
should we lead with tonight? Iran, China, Russia, D.C.?
How about North Korea?
Well, on Crossroads, we usually cover them all. I'm Tal Heinrich.
And I'm David Schuster. Join us each night for hard-hitting interviews, detailed analysis,
and the most important information you need to know.
What is this show about, by the way?
This show is called Man Bites Dog.
How does that relate to...
It's just a philosophy.
It doesn't.
We're
Okay.
making it up as we go along.
Great.
I'm Lauren Izzo on I-24 News. Join me on High Definition right here for an in-depth understanding of Israel's diverse society in groundbreaking documentaries.
Politics, economics, business, and technology. Get the real news and the real insight about what's happening around the world. Michelle McCory breaks down the top stories of the day from the Middle East to the U.S. Weeknights beginning at 7 p.m. Eastern.
Thanks for staying with us. Let's now go to some news just in. And all Boeing 737 MAX 8 and MAX 9 aircraft have been grounded on orders of US President Donald Trump following the crash of an Ethiopian Airlines jet on Sunday. Now, that crash in Addis Ababa killed all 157 people on board. The Federal Aviation Administration is the latest agency to hand down the order after a number of countries ordered the planes not to fly. Now, President Trump said the planes would now be grounded until Boeing comes up with a solution, a decision which Boeing is supportive of.
We're going to be issuing an emergency order of prohibition to ground all flights of the 737 MAX 8 and the 737 MAX 9 and planes associated with that line.
Moving on, and the US State Department has changed its description of the Golan Heights from Israeli-occupied to Israeli-controlled. This according to language in its annual Global Human Rights Report released today. The description was also reflected in a separate section on the West Bank and Gaza Strip, areas which Israel captured along with the Golan Heights in a 1967 Middle East war, which did not refer to the territories as occupied or under occupation. The US State Department later said in a statement that the department's policy regarding the Golan hasn't changed.
The descriptor of what kind of territory in Israel, as we tried to shift last year, and this, by the way, is not a human rights issue. It's a legal status issue, and so the decisions on that get made by the Regional Bureau, by the Legal Advisor's Office, and we followed their lead. But I think what they were trying to signal there is what we're trying to do is report on the human rights situation in those territories, and so you're trying to find a way of describing the place that you're reporting on, and occupied territory has a legal meaning to it. I think what they tried to do was shift more to just a geographic description.
And for more, let's bring in our senior Middle East correspondent, Mohammed Al-Qassim, and Owen Alterman. He stays here with us. Gentlemen, thank you. Firstly, Mohammed, how significant is this?
Even though the State Department spokesperson tried to downplay the significance of it, it's huge. And I think it's part of the pressure that the White House is continuing to exert on the Palestinian Authority, which came out swinging just in the last few minutes. Both Nabila Bourdain, the spokesman for President Mahmoud Abbas, and Saeb Erekat, chief negotiator for the Palestine Liberation Organization, came out harshly criticizing the U.S. decision and saying that these terminologies won't change the facts on the ground. That's on part of the West Bank not being called occupied anymore by the State Department. The Palestinians are waiting to see what President Trump has long-awaited Middle East plan is going to be. But at this point, they've reasserted their position, saying that the U.S. is no longer an honest broker.
So do you think that them doing this just before, so we're expecting that peace plan to come out after the Israeli elections on April 9, would this be some sort of way of maybe softening the blow a little bit or preparing people for what's to come?
Softening, I'm not so sure. I think you're right on the other part of it, saying that it's almost preparing the people of what to expect, even though, again, the U.S. government position, as was stated in the press conference by the State Department spokesperson, saying nothing has changed. Well, let's not forget that about a year ago, the State Department, in its annual human rights report, did drop the word occupied from the occupied Palestinian territories, and that was also criticized by the Palestinian Authority. I think this is, again, part of the changing position of the U.S. administration. This is no longer the U.S. administration of the past. This is President Trump's administration and how it looks at how to proceed in this conflict. And this is definitely going to make it almost impossible for the White House to reconnect with the Palestinian Authority at this point.
Okay, Mohammed Owen, stay with us. We're going now live to London, where they are presenting these votes. Let's take a listen.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. I profoundly regret the decision that this House has taken tonight. I continue to believe that by far the best outcome is that the United Kingdom leaves the European Union in an orderly fashion with a deal. And that the deal we've negotiated is the best and indeed the only deal available. But, Mr. Speaker, I would like to set out briefly how the government means to proceed. 2 weeks ago, I made a series of commitments from this dispatch box regarding the steps we would take in the event that this House rejected the deal on offer. I stand by those commitments in full.
The government has been defeated again by an enormous majority, and they must now accept their deal, their proposal, the one the Prime Minister has put, is clearly dead and does not have the support of this House. And quite clearly, no deal must be taken off the table. We've said that before, and we'll say that again. But it does mean the House has got to come together with a proposal that could be negotiated. The Labour Party has put that proposal, and we will put that proposal again.
And we know that British MPs are voting again on whether they want Britain to leave the European Union without a deal. Last night, MPs rejected Theresa May's draft deal with the EU for a second time by a massive margin of 149, only 2 weeks before Britain is set to leave the EU. And for more, let's now go to our correspondent in London, Jonathan Sacherdotty. Jonathan, thank you. Tell us exactly what is happening right now there in London.
Well, now we've just watched in the House of Commons the division and the counting for that vote, discussing whether or not the House rejects a no-deal Brexit at any time. This is an amendment to Mrs May's own motion. There were 312 votes for and 308 against, so a majority of just 4. However, that is a majority in favour of rejecting a no-deal Brexit at any time. Theresa May had instructed the Conservative Party to vote against this amendment. Her version of it, which she'd hoped would be the vote at the end of this that would be carried, was to say that they weren't too keen on a no-deal Brexit, but that it was the default position of British law if there was no deal made in time. But now we've seen that the House of Commons, by this majority of 4, is defeat for Theresa May and her government has decided that they don't want a no-deal Brexit at any time. So this is, of course, quite an important vote here, another important defeat for Theresa May. They're now dividing again in the chamber, and they'll be voting on the second amendment, which is to put in place something of a plan B. It's quite a complex plan, which certain members of the Conservative Party had proposed some time ago. So far had not had much traction, but now they're voting on whether or not to amend this motion in order to take on board that plan B. We'll see, of course, in about 15 minutes how the House votes on that.
OK, all right. Jonathan, let's go into the studio now. Owen, you look like you have something to say on this.
Yeah, listen, as Jonathan said, an important vote, and it's important because it's another defeat for Prime Minister Theresa May, coming off of a number of defeats she's had over the past few weeks. But let's be very clear, the British Parliament on its own cannot take no deal off the table unless they're actually willing to have a real nuclear option of having Britain unilaterally pull back its notification to leave the EU and basically throw the results of that 2016 referendum in the trash. Unless the British government is willing to do that, they can't choose on their own not to have a no deal, because if there is a deal that the European Union won't agree to, then the British will have to leave the EU without a deal. So, again, an important symbolic vote. But again, as with so many of these votes in the British Parliament, Sarah, it's not a vote that really will be able to be taken to the finish line.
And what does all of this mean for, let's say, stability within the EU?
Look, Sarah, at the end of the day, a lot of the outcomes won't really make much of a difference to those of us outside of Britain, outside of the EU. Whether or not the UK is or is not in a customs union, or is in a Norway Plus agreement, or is in the kind of withdrawal agreement and arrangements that Theresa May has been putting forward and trying to get passed. Within that range of outcomes, I don't think any of us really cares too much. What we're interested in are the more extreme outcomes. If there is to be some kind of second referendum, or even more dramatic, what I just sketched out a moment ago, Britain unilaterally deciding to throw the referendum in the trash and stay in the EU, that would be very, very significant. On the other hand, if Britain does leave in a no deal, particularly if it were to leave in a no deal on March 29th, something that looks incredibly unlikely, especially given the news from the last few minutes, that would be of great import. And of course, the knock-on effects of Brexit, particularly for those of us in Israel, if the Brexit dominoes lead to a general election, and if that general election brings Jeremy Corbyn to power, obviously, Sarah, that's a sea change and a real earthquake for British policy toward this part of the world, something everyone here will be very, very interested in.
Certainly. Oh, and let's go back now to London, to Jonathan Sacherdoti. Jonathan, tell us, what are some of the initial reactions you're hearing coming in following this?
Well, obviously, this is quite an important vote, and the way it's gone has been against what Mrs May wanted again. So one of the interesting factors here is that, in fact, the person behind this amendment to make this a much more conclusive vote on the idea of no deal, she tried to remove the amendment from the table, but in fact was unable to do so late in the day, which just shows some of the internal wrangling and decision-making and deal-making going on within the Conservative Party itself. But what the significance of this apparently quite technical thing is in the bigger picture, and as Owen was saying there, for the wider world, of course, this is the beginning of a process, or at least the middle of a process, let's say. If what we're watching here is a removal of the no-deal option from the table, that does mean that there's going to have to be some sort of extension, which will be voted on tomorrow, or that the House of Commons will have to agree to Theresa May's deal, which was rejected yesterday. So it's quite possible that Theresa May will end up bringing that same deal back to the House of Commons for a vote within the next few days, and she will turn to them and say, look, I offered you this deal, you rejected it. I offered it to you again with some adjustments on the Northern Irish backstop, you rejected it. You then had a vote to remove no deal from the table. Enough of telling me what it is you don't want. You now have to choose a deal. You've chosen to rule out no deal. You have to choose to have some deal. The only deal that she's been able to negotiate with the EU is the one that they've rejected twice already. So she may yet be putting that to them a third time and hoping that enough of them have realised that there are now very few cards left in their hand to play. On the other hand, they could keep rejecting it, and that leaves her in an impossible situation.
Yeah, but I just want to add one point. Again, and this is where, looking at this from the outside, the usual machinery of British government of a two-party system, of an adversarial political culture, and of a parliament with the procedure that's set up where the government controls the agenda, just has not been equipped to deal with Brexit. Again, and traditionally the way Britain works, the government sets the agenda, and as Jonathan correctly explained, Theresa May and her cabinet and her government are the ones who decide what gets voted on. But again, we've seen that the parliament doesn't want what she has on offer. But there are other options that might be able to get a majority in parliament, but that Theresa May has not put out loud to be put to a vote. And the question is, will some of those other options be able to come to a vote, and then will those be able to be voted on? Again, very, very complex, but I think the bottom line is the way the process works will have to change for there to be any hope of a deal. Otherwise, Britain will have to crash out of the deal, out of the European Union, notwithstanding today's vote, or have to go back in the results of the referendum entirely.
And Owen, just very briefly, we're nearly going to a break, but could this be considered, say, a victory of sorts for Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party?
Of sorts, Sarah, but I think Jeremy Corbyn doesn't really care about Brexit. He wants to become Prime Minister. He's made that pretty clear over the course of this process. So I think that Jeremy Corbyn wants to get as quickly as he can toward a general election where he talks about everything other than Brexit. And he thinks, and I think correctly from his perspective, that that's his best way of getting to 10 Downing Street. Again, it seems like that kind of outcome is a long shot, I think, thankfully for many people here in Israel. But I think that it's not so much a victory for Jeremy Corbyn. If anything, it's a victory for some others in the Conservative Party. But again, very, very complex in British politics.
It certainly is. All right, Owen, Mohammed, thank you so much. And we're going out for a short break, but stay with us. We'll be back soon.